Hello, my name is Vincent David. I am in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And I have been here for the last 2 weeks with comrades of the International Communist League to take part in the third Leon Trotsky event, and as well as to get to know a little better the Argentinian Trotskyist movement as it faces a decisive battle against President Javier Milei, a far-right politician elected on a pro-US platform who is dead set on crushing the labor movement and crushing the gains of the working class here. So today I want to talk about the challenges facing the Argentinian workers movement and the Trotskyist left here and the fundamental problem it faces.
So now I'm obviously back from Argentina, and I didn't had time to record a proper video when I was there. So here it is. Let's dive a little more into Argentina, based partly on our article Hot Hair and Sectarianism in the Trotskyists in Argentina in the recent issue of Spartacist. So, as said, I was in Argentina in late October for the third Leon Trotsky conference, where together myself with other comrades of the ICL, we presented presentations at this event, intervene in some of the discussions, were able to meet some people in Trotsky's group in Argentina and get to know a little better the left in this country, the problem it faces, and the challenges of the revolutionary movement in Argentina. I cannot go into a full on explanation of all the problems of Argentina, but the first thing that everybody must know right now is that the country is facing a really devastating economic crisis, which is rapidly destroying the standard of living of most layers of the population. There's hyperinflation, really, really intense inflation, reaching an annual rate of like 287% in March. It has reduced a little bit now, but it is still in the 3 digits. And the economy is completely in ruins. And the right wing government of Javier Milei, which was elected in November 2023, really promised a neoliberal shock therapy to sort of fix this problem. And Milei is explicitly modeling itself on the economic policies of Margaret Thatcher. So Milei is a politician fully aligned with U.S. foreign policy, with the United States in general, and he is committed to repaying the billions of dollars of debt to the IMF and imperialist creditors. And to satisfy these vultures, Javier Milei is right now imposing drastic austerity on the whole country. He has slashing fund to provinces, slashing education, retirement, and social services, eliminating subsidies, enforcing massive layoff, and threatening to sell large swaths of the country's resources and industries and services to foreign corporation. Um, so really what he proposes is a frontal attack against every little gains that the Argentinian working class has. And it's important to understand from outside of Argentina, it doesn't appear obvious how this guy, sort of crazy, with his chainsaw, got into power. And again, to understand why Javier Milei got into power, there are similar processes happening in Argentina as we've seen with the election of Trump or with the rise of the right wing in general in other countries. albeit with the fact that Argentina is an oppressed country, where the central obstacle to development is foreign imperialist oppression. And what is important to understand is that for decades, Argentina has been more or less in an ongoing crisis, which is only getting worse and worse, with sometimes little upticks of growth, but generally the economy has been in ruin. And it's really decades of government led by the Peronists, which have basically caused this crisis. You cannot understand Argentinian politics if you don't understand a thing or two about Peronism. That is the movement who's originated with Juan Perón towards the end of World War II, who was president of Argentina. And Perón really represents the wing of the Argentinian bourgeoisie, which, to advance and to seek to develop its own position, leans on the working class, on the workers' movement. Perón famously concluded an alliance with the trade union movement and even leftists, although he was a general, fairly really anti-communist, and through this was able to lean on these forces, the force of the workers' movement, to gain more space from the imperialist bourgeoisie oppressing Argentina, while at the same time giving concessions to the workers' movement. Perón is basically the Argentinian form of populism, what we see in multiple Latin American countries, like Cardenas in Mexico is the other example. And I cannot go through a whole history of Peronism, but essentially, Peronism is the number one force inside the workers' movement in Argentina. And various succession of Peronist government, what they did over decades is basically navigating the two pressures in society, the pressure of the working class and the pressure of the imperialists wanting to repay the debt. And for decades, Peronist government have done basically just enough to piss off the imperialists, to piss off the foreign creditors, while at the same time giving a tiny bit to the working class, but also attacking them massively for the imperialist creditors. So they've basically done for decades enough to piss off the imperialists, enough to piss off the working class, and basically not enough to satisfy any sort of these two fundamental camps, the imperialists and the working class, which are sort of tearing Argentina apart. This sort of orientation has led the countries to stagnation, into crisis. The imperialists want more money. The working class is restless. And Javier Milei and I have to say also, every single one of these government was utterly corrupt and became utterly hated by the working masses. And so Javier Milei is this figure that emerges which proposes basically to, rather than stop this balancing act between workers and the imperialists, and go full on one side with the imperialists. And he's sort of an outsider. He plays the anti-establishment card, and he really tapped into the resentment of millions of Argentinians against the political class, which he calls the casta, the caste. And that's how he was able to get into power, essentially. You'll meet in Argentina, I myself met a lot of people, like, random people, taxi drivers, people in stores or whatever, when you engage a bit in conversation. A lot of people who will tell you they are ex-peronistas, used to be peronistas, because their fathers, their mother would tell them, vote for Perón, vote for Evita, because they're the one who care about the poor. But now they've sort of turned their back on Peronism and they're trying Javier Milei. And during the election last year, you had Massa Peronista versus Javier Milei, and it's Milei who won, because for people it was really, do we want to continue with the same status quo, or do we want to sort of jump with Milei into the unknown? And for millions, it was better to jump into the unknown than continue with the unbearable status quo. And so you really have to understand how the economic crisis and the massive devastation of living standards of the population, how this is really the base, the explanation behind Milei's victory. And so since he's been in power, Milei has been able to pass multiple laws and reforms, basically seeking to dismantle a ton of social programs and really pushing austerity. He has shut the door for Argentina joining the BRICS. It's really a whole new political era opening in Argentina. And so, on the other side of the class war that Milei is waging, you have in Argentina still a powerful working class with powerful trade unions. And to open fully the country to imperialist splendor, the Argentinian bourgeoisie need to break the resistance of the workers' movement. And since Milei's election, there have been a number of large demonstrations, partial strikes, and two one-day general strikes called by the powerful CGT and CTA union federations. And so they have shown that there is a certain willingness to fight. Milei is basically targeting all the gains of Peronism. And however, none of these demonstrations has succeeded in even slowing down Milei's attack, and no sustained struggle has been organized. So he's been able to pass his ley bases, the basic law, through Congress a few months ago, winning approval from his imperialist masters. So this law that he passed a few months back includes measures to privatize state-owned enterprise, restrict the right to strike, dismantle permanent contract in favor of temporary and precarious work, slash unemployment benefits. And meanwhile, repression is intensifying with attacks on both trade unions and leftist organizations and new laws to prevent blocking the streets. And recently he has slashed a ton of other regulations, cut services for women. Anyway, it's ongoing constantly. This government is really rampaging and destroying a ton of defensible gains that actually matter to the working class. More recently, when I was there was struggles in schools and universities because basically the government is seeking to cut completely the funding to universities and keep the university sector just only completely private. And this is really something that is keenly felt in Argentina, a nation where education is really important, which has a lot of culture, and where accessing university or having universities that are somewhat accessible to working class has been one of the gain of Peronism, which Milei is now seeking to dismantle. And so the question is, why have these partial struggles, one-day strikes, demonstration have been so ineffective? How come? Because you do have a powerful organized working class. The CGT is almost 4 million workers. And the reason, as I already mentioned, is that the bulk of the Argentinian working class is under the leadership of the Peronistas. And the Peronistas have clearly shown that they have no intention of seriously mounting a struggle against the government. And honestly, the leadership of the CGT union is openly betraying workers' interests in collaborating and negotiating with the government. So while they oppose Milei's worst attack, the union bureaucracy, or the bulk of them, still preaches social dialogue with the government, respect for the parliamentary process, and basically negotiate how much to impoverish the general population. And the reason for this is, generally the Peronists, as I also mentioned, represent a wing of the national bourgeoisie. And for them, their premise is always that the capitalist class must remain in power and that the imperialist demands must be somewhat satisfied. And so that's why they negotiate only how much to attack workers. The classic slogan of the Peronists is La patria no se vende, the country is not for sale. And this slogan is a classic slogan of the Peronist movement and expresses the legitimate desire among the masses over against the imperialist debt and the sale of Argentina's resources to foreign companies. But yet the Peronistas have no program to combat imperialism, as they have shown each time they are in government. And so it's really the leadership of the Peronistas in the unions, in the parties, that constitutes the main obstacle to put the working class in motion in fighting for its own interests. In the end, solving Argentina's economic problems will require attacking both private property and the interests of the imperialists, which would directly threaten the Argentinian bourgeoisie's own interests. And that's the problem for the Peronista, who uphold those interests and who represent a wing of the bourgeoisie, and who will therefore oppose any strategy, any method of class struggle capable of defeating the bourgeoisie, and instead seek an illusory compromise between capital and labor. And that's why it's because of this outlook that the CGT has organized strike in a way that caused minimal disruption, weeks apart, often for only a few hours or a day at a time, and in order not to provoke a major crisis that forces the government to back down. And basically, what the Peronistas are doing now, there's been increasing dissension among the ranks of the union bureaucracy over the total capitulatory perspective of the CGT bureaucracy and of the Peronist parties. And what they are organizing now is for the next sort of the equivalent of the midterms election that they're going to take place next year, and are sort of trying to organize a new sort of left-wing Peronista camp with Cristina, who's a Kirchner, who's a historic leader of the Peronist movement. But really, what this prepares is, again, to perpetuate the same cycle of Peronista and neoliberal governments administering the imperialist plunder of the country, while the conditions of the masses just gets worse and worse. And it's really this alternative between Peronista and neoliberal government which actually paved the way to Milei's victory in the first place. Now, to the left of the Peronista, in Argentina, we find the largest movement of ostensible Trotskyists in the world. So most are organized in the FITU, the Frente de Izquierda y de Trabajadores Unidad, the Workers and Left Front Unity. This is an electoral alliance of 4 organizations which have, on paper at least, tens of thousands of members. You have the Partido Obrero, the Movimiento Socialista de los Trabajadores, the Partido de los Trabajadores Socialista, and Izquierda Socialista. These are 4 of the main Trotskyist organizations. And there are also dozens of smaller Trotskyist groups, plus assorted Maoists. And so the left in Argentina is quite big and quite vibrant, honestly, to the point where, although the FITU only collects a few percentages every election, 3 to 4, but they are known in the general population, including among Peronista workers. You see them on TV. They are known figures. They have MPs in parliament who make fiery speech against the government about socialism sometimes. And so they are really a figure and a part of the political landscape of Argentina, particularly also because historically they used to be even bigger. And they lead a certain number of trade unions. I'll come back to this in a second. And so from outside, Argentina looks like there's a great concentration of revolutionaries and Trotskyists with cadres who have seen decades of struggle. And there's a working class which hasn't been defeated yet. But this begs the question then, why, with all of this, the workers' movement or the socialist left in general have not managed to convince significant layers of the working class that they are an alternative to the succession of right-wing Peronistas and Milei, essentially. And that is really, I think, the key question. So the urgent task for Trotskyists in Argentina is to break workers from the Peronistas. If this is not achieved, there will be no clear victory against Milei, much less a socialist revolution. And recent struggles have shown that the working class still overwhelmingly follows the current leadership of union federations and the Peronistas in general. So when the union bureaucracy calls a general strike, it is widely observed and effectively shuts down the country. And on the other hand, when unions refuse to call for protest, and it's only the left that calls it, you only have a tiny little protest, a few thousand people, and no significant participation by the organized working class. And to break the influence of the Peronista, the left must provide a genuine alternative to the unrestrained national subordination offered by Milei, a path that fuses the just desire for national liberation from imperialist oppression with the fight for social liberation. What is posed point blank is the need to repudiate the betrayal of the Union leadership and unify all sectors of the oppressed behind the power of the industrial working class, under a leadership which is prepared to fight both the domestic rulers and the imperialists who stand behind them. The problem of the Argentinian left in general, there are a few, but one I think is quite striking when you're on the ground and when you look at what they're doing, is that the bulk of the left, the FITU, and most Trotskyist group rejects the struggle against imperialism in the name of anti-capitalism. Now, of course, the left is against the IMF, against imperialism, but they really center their activity, their demand around the fight against capitalism. And in this manner, they are able to call all the betrayals of the Peronists, to criticize the Peronist for all the betrayals in the world, but they completely leave to the Peronists the monopoly of fighting for the national liberation of Argentina. And they actually fail to criticize the main crime of the Peronist, which is their incapacity and their unwillingness to actually do what's necessary to free Argentina from imperialism. And so you have this picture of a left which is sizable, but which is quite cut out of the bulk of the workers' movement, which is led by the Peronist. And the strategy of the left to try to break workers from the Peronist is basically a clasista strategy. Clasista, like classist, like class struggle, more economic militancy, more combativity, more fighting tone against the bourgeoisie. But the issue is this, is that the appeal of the Peronists stems from them saying that they're fighting to liberate the country. And this has such a strong appeal in Argentina. And if the left does not compete on this terrain, they will remain marginal, honestly. So, for example, when I was there was a one-day strike of the Camioneros Union. It was a one-day, not a general strike, but a one-day strike in multiple sectors of transport. Truckers, longshoremen, people who work on ships, airplanes as well, and airports workers. And the strike was organized by the Peronista bureaucracy, obviously. It was a one-day thing. Obviously, it wasn't going to change much of the situation, but still, it was widely observed. And the theme of the strike, the main demand of the strike, was a strike for the sovereignty of the country against the imperialists. That was like the theme of the strike organized by the union bureaucracy. And so the left, counterposing to this only class struggle, economic militancy, is obviously unable to compete with the attraction of the mantle of national liberation, which is completely left to the Peronista. You cannot break the working class from the Peronist leaders by only counterposing economic militancy. You have the left actually has to take up the mantle of the fight for the freedom of Argentina from imperialism as its central axis in order to really be a factor to compete with the Peronist leadership. And so if you look at the left, they are numerous, they sound very radical, very militant, very orthodox. And they'll do these assemblies with very radical slogans, very radical speeches about socialist revolution, about the treachery of Peronista and the union bureaucracy. But given that that they left the monopoly of the national liberation struggle to the Peronists, they are unable to make serious headways amongst the bulk of the working class. Now, you do have some of the leftists in Argentina who understand that national liberation is key, is the key task really of the Argentinian revolution. However, so we've met some of them. For example, the Partido Piquetero. We met their national deputy when we were there, and there we had a debate over how to split the workers' movement from the Peronist leaders and from the national bourgeoisie. And again, for us, this trend of the left in Argentina, who understands the necessity of national liberation, is stuck in the opposite framework where they capitulate and tail the national bourgeoisie. So, for example, I mentioned the Partido Piquetero. They called for a vote for Massa, sort of right-wing Peronists in the last election in order to block Milei. And in this sense, many workers see them as, a part of the old and hated and discredited Peronista status quo. And so what this creates, with the left being quite isolated from the bulk of the workers' movement and really rejecting the mantle of anti-imperialist struggle, it creates a very sectarian impulse and outlook from the left organization. So many on the left seize on the very real betrayals of the bureaucracy to really put forward this sectarian perspective, calling for organizing independently, but what they mean by that, separately from the bulk of the working class. To the Peronista-led union, they counterpose alternative organization that are supposedly independent and more militant than the union dominated by the bureaucracy. They have neighborhood assemblies, piqueteros, unemployed or semi-employed picketers, combative or anti-bureaucratic unions, which are usually referenced to small unions led by Trotskyists, autoconvocados, so self-organized groups, action committees, retired social movements, etc. Obviously, it's important to organize those sectors, like the students, like those unions outside of the main union federations, like the piqueteros, the unemployed. That's very key. However, there is a tendency in general in the Argentinian left to counterpose those organizations to the CGT and the CTA unions, the bulk of the workers' movement. And by doing so, the left is really dodging the fundamental obstacle of the union bureaucracies. So instead of fighting at the base of the unions to replace their current misleaders with a revolutionary and an anti-imperialist leadership, they sort of go around and organize outside of these unions these sort of groups which are frankly on the margin of the bulk of the labor movement. And this whole framework means accepting that it's impossible to win the working class away from the Peronistas and to really split them from their current misleaders. And so the clearest example of this trend was expressed on May Day this year. So I know it dates from a few months back, but it's still worth talking about it because what happened on May Day is still very controversial among leftists in Argentina. So the union federation, the Peronista Union Federation, called a demonstration which was attended by more than 300,000 workers. Our comrades were there, and it was massive, and bulk of organized industrial workers there. And the majority of the left either boycotted this demonstration. So the PTS, the MST, the Maoists, and many smaller Trotskyist groups really, boycotted it and called for a boycott of it, and instead organized their own little rally at other locations. Or else they organized independent columns on the margins of the demo that really did not mingle with the CGT organized workers. That was Partido Obrero Izquierda Socialista. That's what they did. There's still a lot of tension about what took place on this day between these various groups. So the PTS dismissed the CGT mobilization as a symbolic act, while the MST went as far as calling it a reactionary march, a demo of hundreds of thousands of workers. Other groups argued that the CGT was totally discredited, that there's no illusions in it, that workers who attended were complicit in the betrayals of their leaders, that going to this union demonstration was a capitulation to the bureaucracy, or even that no workers would come to it. And instead, on the grounds that the leadership of the trade unions is selling out the working class to the government, which, it is true, they each organize their own separate activities. So, our comrades on that day went to the big march and then had to march like a mile or two to get to the event of the PTS, which was organized separately with, speeches for socialist revolution, blah, 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 but with only their own little members, separate from the bulk of the working class who was demonstrating elsewhere in Buenos Aires. This meant really dividing the working class and abandoning the fight for the leadership of the unions, leaving workers who came out to protest Milei's attacks in the hands of the Peronistas. So yeah, we intervene in these various demonstrations at events organized by the FITU parties. Their deputies, congressional deputies, gave fiery speeches about revolution, but really it is meaningless if it is not directed towards breaking the working class from its current leaders. Workers won't be convinced to do this by socialists going to separate location and proclaiming the need for socialist revolution while refusing to fight in the unions against the bureaucracy that is utterly opposed to such perspective. So it is necessary to really intervene inside the CGT and the CTA unions and really make struggles in these arena the central task of Trotskyists, and take part in the fight as in each individual workplace, putting forward at each step what needs to be done, and really linking the day-to-day struggles of workers to a strategy that can fight the imperialist plunder of the country. And this is how workers will be allowed to test their leaders in action, and how the left will be able to show concretely how the current leadership of the trade union is unable to meet workers' demand and is unable to free the country from imperialist oppression and to fight really the lackey of the imperialist, Javier Milei. And so the FITU parties call for a plan of struggle, up and including to a general strike. Of course, this is needed, but calls for a general strike without having a perspective to split the CGT and CTA from their misleaders, without a perspective to free the country from imperialism, and really without an orientation towards mobilizing the base of the unions against their leaders, is really meaningless. I had multiple discussion in Argentina. This is a bit of a sidetrack, but there's a bit of a bizarre conception of politics, or at least which I don't understand, over the plan of struggle, plan de lucha. Every group in Argentina calls for a plan de lucha, a plan of struggle. This is a bit like, how are we going to struggle? Fine. And when I asked them, well, to these organizations, and this is many of them, PO, PTS, Izquierda Socialista, etc., what is the plan of struggle? The plan of struggle is usually to have rank and file assemblies, base committees, autoconvocados. That's the plan of struggle. Assemblies. And I'm like, well, what are these assemblies going to talk about? They're going to talk about the plan of struggle. And what is the plan of struggle? Assemblies that will talk about the plan of struggle. I've had multiple of this circular debate, which always comes down to a failure by the left to really propose its own plan of struggle. They are always calling on the CGT to come up with a plan of struggle, but without themselves proposing a plan and really trying to fight for it inside the bulk of the trade union movement, or else proposing a plan which is just creating more assemblies that will talk about a plan. That's a real fetishism inside the Argentinian left that I found, where endless circular discussion lead to basically the Trotskyist movement not putting forward its own strategy of struggle and not seeking to push it inside the bulk of the working class. And so the Argentinian Trotskyist movement, it was very clear during our trip there that they must change course and break with this sectarianism, both towards the workers of the CGT, but also towards the national question and the question of the fight against imperialism. Milei's attack really threatened to destroy all the very gains that formed the basis of Peronism's support among the oppressed layers, nationalizations, subsidies, social programs, etc. And the workers' movement, including those who still support the Peronistas, has an objective interest in defeating these attacks. And So the situation is ripe for Trotskyists to really aggressively appeal to the trade union for united front action to defend workers' basic living condition. So this would both advance the struggle against Milei and for the working class condition, as well as expose their current leadership. So one of the reasons there isn't more sustained mobilization in Argentina is that while many workers would support the demand to free the country from imperialism, many would support canceling the debt, wage increases linked to inflation, opposition to privatization. But the problem is most workers do not see who is going to do this. Many of them says, okay, yes, the status quo can go on. Even those who voted for Milei a lot of them might start to regret it, how they see that a lot of what they benefit is being cut. But they think that if Milei goes, then what? The old leaders, hated and discredited, will come back. And so that's a key sentiment that the left must respond to. Because one of the reasons for Milei's popularity is that the previous Peronistas government were really hated for leading the country into this economic chaos and hyperinflation. So most of the left agrees that we should call for repudiating the debt, expropriating the banks, and nationalizing industry. And they call for these things too. But to actually carry this out and provide an alternative for the dead ends of neoliberal government or return to the hated Peronistas, it is necessary to have a perspective of political struggle for workers' power, to show that there is an other way between this alternance of hated Peronists and neoliberals. And this is exactly what both the union bureaucracy and the Trotskyists don't have. So we've argued ourselves for a concrete plan of struggle that addresses the main problem that the population is currently facing, and linking this to the perspective of a workers' government of the CGT, the CTA's union federations, and the FITU. So this has been basically our sort of our strategic perspective, a government of the Union Federation and the left parties that could free the country and really nationalizing the industry and really responds to the needs of the population. But all of the left parties are against our call, and I've had multiple debate about this with them. Why? Mostly because it includes the trade unions, and those are led by traders. And this really misses the crucial point. For the unions to fight for a workers' government, the Peronista leadership needs to be removed and replaced with genuine anti-imperialists and revolutionaries. And what a lot of the debates that I've had over this slogan really reveal how many militants inside the FITU simply do not comprehend or reject that the task of communists is to replace the Peronistas and fight for communist leadership of the trade unions, not least by aiming for a government of trade unions and revolutionary parties, that is, a workers' government. The objections to our call has usually been, oh, well, the bureaucrats are traitors, so you want a government with traitors. Well, we make clear that actually the premise for this is to kick out all the traitors who are negotiating with the government. Other arguments are just basically straight up opposition to any sort of orientation or united front with the CGT or the CTAs, for example. I've had debates with people from either Nuevo Mas or Política Obrera, which are groups outside of the FITU. Those who know Argentinian left will surely know them, who are really adamant against any sort of orientation towards the CGT or the CTA or the union federations in general. And so they believe that this to call for a government with the union federation and the left parties is completely crazy. But meanwhile, our call, actually, we took it from Trotsky, who called in France, for example, and other places also for a CGT, Communist Party and Socialist Party government. There are many also of the smaller Trotskyist groups outside of the FITU who object to our call because it includes FITU parties in our call for a workers' government, and that the FITU is focused overwhelmingly on electoralism and breeds illusions that Milei can be defeated through parliament. That's a regular criticism you'll get from groups outside of the FITU. And while this criticism is correct to a certain extent, the FITU parties still represent tens of thousands of people who claims to be communists in this country. And so you need um, uh, and you really need a perspective towards these organization, and they nonetheless represent a part of the vanguard of the working class in Argentina, and really the principal obstacle to building a revolutionary opposition to the Peronistas inside the unions. You cannot just dismiss the FITU because they're, smaller than the union federations. Um, The most serious argument against our call is raised by groups arguing that now is not the time to raise the slogan for an alternative government. The working class is not ready for taking power, the period is not revolutionary, the tasks are defensive, and it is necessary to wait until there is more sustained action around economics demand before putting forward a perspective of political struggle against the government. And so it's obvious that in Argentina, the working class is not about to launch a direct struggle for power. Uh, but it is only by organizing today towards this goal that we can advance the workers' cause, and really responding to this concern that I've outlined a few minutes ago, to workers that are worried that if Milei goes, then the old leaders will come back, and to convince workers to make the sacrifices necessary to wage effective struggle, particularly when there's massive unemployment, skyrocketing inflation, and workers are really, honestly, a lot of them starving. They need to know not only that, what they are fighting against, but also what they are fighting for. And in Trotsky's writings on France, like once again with France, he makes this point multiple times against the communist parties, that in an acute crisis, workers are not going to make tremendous sacrifice only for a few more percentage of wage increase. That they demand and need a broader political perspective to really solve the problem of the country, and that only on this basis will they be ready to make the sacrifice necessary. And so that's our answer why our call for a CGT CTA FITU government responds. It actually at least points to a way forward, uh, uh, addressing these concerns of the workers. It points to a way also to combat the misleadership of the trade unions inside the unions, can be used as a lever by pitting the base of the union against the top, and is also, let's be honest, a call that is aimed at combating the sectarianism of the FITU parties, who do not want to be near the CGT, do not want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, and force it to really have an orientation towards the CGT. And coupled with our call to make the anti-imperialist struggle the central plank of the revolutionary movement in Argentina, against the sectarian rejection of the bulk of the left for this task, that is really what we believe should be the orientation of the left in Argentina. So on all these counts, leaving the national liberation struggle to the Peronist, really having a sectarian outlook towards the bulk of the organized working class, and really separating themselves from the masses, um, the course in general of the Argentinian left is pointing towards disaster, honestly. And the only way out of Argentina's crisis is to unite all the oppressed behind the power of the organized working class. And it's key for socialists to forge militant caucuses in the unions and seek to organize united front actions with the trade unions, with those leaders as well, in order to combat the bureaucrats, show them in action how they are inadequate to respond to the task and to really fulfill the needs of their members. And that is the perspective that is lacking among Argentinian Trotskyists, I find. And so this is really what's posed the Argentinian left, to make this decisive turn in order to really be able to combat the Peronist leaders and advance the fight against Milei and for the liberation of Argentina and of all Latin America. So, like and follow for more. We will surely write more about Argentina and pursue discussion with groups there. Share the video also if you found it useful. It helps with promoting our channel and our politics. And stay tuned.